Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. On Sunday, December 10th, the world celebrates the 75th anniversary of adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Today, Dr. Zaid Ra'ad Al-Hussein joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk about the paradox of the Declaration, how it is at once so obvious and also so frequently violated. A former Jordanian diplomat, Al-Hussein served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018, and now is the president and CEO of the International Peace Institute and a professor of the practice at the University of Pennsylvania. Let's listen.
Zaid Ra'ad Al-Hussein, thank you so much for joining me in Public Health on Call to talk about the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
75 years of trying to achieve the obvious. So much of what the Declaration speaks to is so obvious and yet so difficult for us to seemingly achieve. It sets both the basis for human civilization, and yet seems to be in so many respects almost unattainable for us. And we're trapped between an aspiration, what we ought to be, what we should have been a long time ago, and perhaps the primordial part of our being, the primitive, the underdeveloped part of our nature, that always snaps us back into something craven and narrow and small, as opposed to achieving what we ought to have achieved after the horrors of 2 world wars and the Holocaust. And so it's an inspiration, remains so, and a frustration all wrapped in one.
Thank you. Take me back to when it was adopted. Why did the world see a need to put together a Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Well, the question can be reframed into this: why do we need law? Why do we need law in the sort of higher realm? I mean, of course, anyone dealing with a banking issue will see, reams and reams of paper and all these regulations written down, because one can't memorize all of it. But the higher law, you should not kill, or thou shalt not kill. Why do we need to put it into a constitution? Why do we need to write it into a penal code? It suggests that we're still so unreliable, that reason alone is insufficient for guiding us. And we have to encage ourselves because we're so distrustful of what we're capable of doing, and rightly so. We put ourselves in some sort of legal cage, and we have to trap ourselves, because then the worst instincts will overcome and occupy us. And the Declaration wasn't a legal text as such. It was an inspiration born out of the fact that out of 2 world wars and the Holocaust, the horrors were so great that we simply could not experience it again, or ought not to experience it again. And the amazing thing is that it took, close to 100 million lives and possibly more to get to that point where you have to lost lives, if you include the 1918 influenza outbreak as well. And to get to that point which finally convinced us that we ought to be doing the obvious. I mean, it's quite amazing, really. It's quite amazing. One of the articles in the Declaration is equal pay for equal work. And still, in so many corporations around the world, so many organizations, so many offices, we can't achieve it.
It seems like the Declaration, in your view, is sort of a living paradox. It should be obvious, but yet we still can't live up to it.
Well, it is obvious. I mean, when you look at one of the critical articles of the Declaration, which then made it into a legal document, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 14, the right to a fair trial. I mean, the right to a fair trial in every sort of spiritual, religious tradition is there. If you are not guaranteed a fair trial, it's arbitrary, and it basically paves the way to tyranny. So when you ask the question, how many judicial systems around the world can guarantee a right to a fair trial? I mean, you're really pushing it. I mean, because we see miscarriages of justice everywhere.
Right.
So yes, I mean, it's an amazing document because it's still very appropriate to the times. And yet, we see many who shirk or don't sort of believe the importance of it. And they don't, I suppose, realize the thin film that separates us from total anarchy. Total anarchy.
Right.
And they like to believe that, yes, well, it's all obvious. And in any case, we have it in our laws. And, well, then apply the law, and apply it fairly and do your job, toward your people. And then we wouldn't be having to come back and have to remind ourselves all the time of some of the most basic tenets contained within the Universal Declaration.
Now, within the Declaration are both civil and political rights and economic and social rights, and they kind of come together. How do you see the importance of having all of that in one place?
Well, it's critical because I think for all human rights people, they're all interwoven and almost inseparable. But for ideological reasons, and the divisions, the ideological divisions that occupied much of the world in the first part of the 20th century, it was deemed that the only way to get anywhere with this, the taking the elements of the Declaration and then putting them into laws to separate them into two parts, the civil and political rights in one and economic, social, and cultural rights in the other. And that the civil and political rights would speak to the desires, the ideological disposition of the countries of the West, and the latter to the countries of the Soviet bloc. And it's very unfortunate. And I think most, if not all, human rights people believe that all of it has to be viewed as one, and that the Declaration therefore sort of creates that impression. What it does do though, it's sort of, because it came out of the Second World War, the first part deals with what is absolutely essential. So you simply have to, everyone has to be treated fairly and equally before the law. There can't be any discrimination of any sort. And all the basic sort of civil and political rights are there. And economic, social, and cultural rights were later viewed, perhaps even at the time, as rights to be attained progressively when the resources are available. They ought to be attained. And we see this as not a license to foot drag. It's a recognition that some countries, it's basically the equity argument, some countries have been so exploited by the colonial powers during colonial times that when they emerge as independent nations, that they needed extra help to reach the levels of development which would enable them, therefore, to realize the rights of their people. Now, that also has to be, you have to qualify that well, but in many countries you have elite capture. A certain number of families almost control the state, and they're very well connected to outside interests.
Right. And so you can have expectations even in those countries for doing that.
There ought to be no excuse. There ought to be no excuse. I visited one country when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the country was middle income. And I sat with the president, and half the population of that country under the age of 5 was severely malnourished. And I said, how can you explain this? I mean, there is an explanation, obviously. And he said, well, we have a vaccine program ongoing with the World Health Organization. And I said, well, that's very good. And I'm delighted you have that. But you still haven't answered the question. of having half your population under the age of 5 severely malnourished in a country that certainly has resources. And so what we, of course, understood from this is that there's a willful denial.
Yeah.
The economists are very good at using euphemisms, populations that are excluded and inclusive policies and, all of this. They fail to really understand how deliberate the exclusion is in so many countries. It's not accidental that people are left out of the labor market, that people are denied access to health or access to education. It's willful in many countries because these people are of a different ethnic stock, a different religion, they look different, whatever the criteria may be, they're excluded. And what the Universal Declaration says is that we're all born, free and equal, and that's where it starts. And there ought to be no discrimination on any of the given grounds.
I'm very struck by your description of the Declaration as a cage that we need to control ourselves. That it's what separates us from baser instincts, as you said. Yeah, the beast within us. How does that cage work? How strong is that cage?
So let me start. I think what's worth pointing out, for all the listeners, if ever you're in upstate New York, go visit Hyde Park and the Roosevelt home. FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, there's a museum attached to their mansion. And in that mansion, you see, in the museum, as you walk around, you'll see a copy of the Universal Declaration, Eleanor's copy. And of course, she and 5 or 4 others played a pivotal role, an outsized role in making sure that the Declaration was adopted 75 years ago. And it's the draft, the second draft of the Universal Declaration, the Cassin draft. René Cassin had taken John Humphrey's original draft and he put together his own draft. And you see Eleanor's writing on the draft in pencil. And the most amazing thing about that draft is how it starts in the preamble. And the words are sharp. It starts off, paragraph 1, ignorance and contempt of human rights have been among the principal causes of the sufferings of humanity. Ignorance and contempt, the 2 words. This was later sort of moved around, and in the final version of the Declaration, it was the second paragraph in the preamble. So they dropped it from the first to the second. But the sharpness of that first opening sort of salvo, if you're going to be ignorant of what is contained here, and you're contemptuous of it, then we will revisit continuously, cyclically, what it is that we've just gone through. So either you do this seriously, or we pay the price again. And so it's a really sharp opening. And I actually wish they'd kept it. I think it would have been a sharper opening and dramatic, almost like a slap in the face.
Right.
You humanity deserve a slap. 2 world wars and the Holocaust. And, this is not a celebration. This is a recognition of how weak we are and what we need to do. Don't celebrate the adoption of the Declaration. Recognize in it the failings that brought us to this point. And this is the beginning of a prescription, and you either take it seriously or you don't.
How seriously has the world taken this? And how does the Declaration have an impact today? You were the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. What power did you have? How does this work in practice?
When I studied at Hopkins back in the 14th century, one of the courses I took was logic, and there are these basic principles in logic, amongst which you have the law of contradiction, right? The basic law of contradiction, and what you realize in life is that contradictions abound everywhere. Almost everywhere. So you can celebrate the enormous strides that the human rights agenda has been able to achieve. And you can, you look around and you see, whether whether we talk about gender rights, whether we talk about LGBTQ rights, whether we talk about rights of persons with disabilities, and you can keep going on, and you can marvel at the achievement, but then you despair at the pushback, and you despair at how difficult it has been, and how people seemingly don't mind the proposition that we can harm each other, as opposed to assuring rights where we embrace each other. And it's so amazing. It's so amazing that we still, almost like in Circus Maximus or in the Colosseum, we enjoy the battle and combat of polemics, and we don't realize how that's still primitive. That's right. Still primitive. That we should be enjoying convergence and a deeper convergence. So the declaration set the stage for these enormous achievements, I think is undeniable. That we've still fallen short in many respects is also undeniable. And that contradiction exists. I mean, one doesn't exclude the other. And so we can celebrate and despair at the same time. And I think looking at the world today, it's the same feeling. It's almost inescapable. We seem to be, delight in our genius at creating artificial intelligence, or let's say, large language models and technology that will send us to the outer reaches of space eventually. And yet, look at us. I mean, all the wars that we have to deal with, climate change that we have to battle against. We've been struggling for 2 years to put together either to revise the international health regulations or put together a treaty to prevent the next pandemic. After over $18 trillion spent on COVID recovery, 14 governments collapsed, most countries still, with enormous debts owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's still, why is it so difficult for us?
Well, I have to say, I reread the Universal Declaration to prepare for this interview, and it just seems like such a relevant and pressing document. You find yourself saying out loud, yes, why can't this happen? Even today. I mean, it is written so clearly, as you pointed out before, and really speaks to today. There are a lot of people who are speaking in the language of human rights and expressing frustration in the language of human rights for tragedies that are happening all around the world.
Yeah, it's the most translated document in the history of humankind. And I think this is where also it did a real service. It was written simply and simple language. And I think the sad part of what happened subsequently is that the lawyers started to get at the text and started to write many of the subsequent treaties in legal language. And now at times you have these sort of what's called general comments. They emerge from the treaty bodies, these bodies set up to monitor each treaty, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and so forth. And they issue these general comments which can be very technical and very legal. And I think it's one of the problems we have, that we sometimes, technical issues demand a language which correspond to the complexity of the technical side of things. But I think we all try to serve the public. And in that, we ought not to be sort of massaging our own vanity, by playing the expert and seemingly detached from people because we have expert knowledge and we studied, took extra degrees to accumulate it, and therefore, somehow we're morally superior. And that is completely wrong. And no wonder there's a reaction against people who are considered to be brandishing their credentials, whether they're lawyers or accountants or engineers or physicians or scientists.
It'd be much better to speak plainly to what's gone wrong.
Speak plainly. speak plainly, dispense with much of this jargon, make it accessible. I mean, certainly there's things of orders of complexity which most people can't fathom, including me. But for a lot of this is not it's not that complex, and we should keep it in language that makes it available to everyone. And I think that's also one of the lessons of the Declaration, is that the rights are enumerated. Now here I'm using enumerated. Why don't I just say listed? The rights are listed in a way that is understandable to everyone.
You mentioned the pandemic treaty, and you are working to help the world put together a pandemic treaty. How does that relate to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yeah, so I'm not negotiating the treaty, but I'm monitoring it closely, and my organization is hosting retreats for the negotiators, such that we can arrive at an agreement by May of 2024. And there are two tracks in play at the moment. There's an attempt to revise the 2005 International Health Regulation, which currently exists, and then an examination of whether or not there ought to be a treaty that would prevent the next, COVID-19 from happening, essentially. And one of the critical issues that has emerged is this issue of equity, because throughout much of the text, when we look at countries that need to prepare themselves in order to prevent the outbreak, or to respond accordingly, and then prevent the outbreak and respond accordingly if it should happen. When you look at what's required, there would be an enormous amount of financing that would be demanded. And for many countries, they just feel that they won't be in a position to do the sorts of things that the treaty will envision unless there's some rebalancing of support. And here, part of the discussion hinges a lot on this issue of access and benefit sharing, that the laboratories, the research establishments need access to the samples, to priority pathogens that emerge, so that they can be sequenced and properly understood. And then as a vaccine is produced, if at all possible, then the vaccine needs to be distributed equitably, and there ought to be some benefit sharing where the countries that made available the information and others have access to the technology itself. And it's still highly contentious, but you can see working throughout all of it is this issue of equity, and whether or not we can find a space where both industry as well as the research community and countries, whether global north or the so-called global south, find a balance and find a reasonableness and can agree to the treaty itself. So human rights is there in almost everything. It's not a separate issue. It's very much infused in much of what it is that we do. And one of the questions I have to my students at Penn every year, I say to them, do you think human rights is a weak or strong force in the human experience? Because you can make the argument it's weak, right? I mean, so there are no faculties for human rights, right? And most universities don't even have a center for human rights, and it doesn't figure in the literature in social science, and it's not in business literature. And some law schools have centers for human rights, but you can make the argument that it's pretty weak, right? And yet, if it's so weak, why do authoritarian leaders or those who have tyrannical instincts, why do they imprison dissidents, hang them, shoot them? And why are they so fearful of them? Why can't they stand criticism of any sort if it's so weak?
As you look forward, as you think about the next 75 years of human rights, recognizing how imperfect our world is, how do you see the human rights movement advancing Do you see that it can become stronger? Do you see that we can have fewer, mornings where we wake up and open the newspaper and just see one, violation of human rights after another?
Yeah, I think the progression is never quite linear. There are always going to be setbacks, but it's not easy to stop it, because we have within us this an incredible capacity to overcome the first instinct. The first instinct is self-preservation, and yet the numbers of people around the world, the frontline human rights defenders, that are willing to speak out and pay an enormous price for their speaking out, to be imprisoned and not see your family for years, to be tortured, knowing that this is the price you're going to pay for saying something, for demonstrating, for taking to the street. I mean, it really lifts the spirit. It makes you realize we're not just machines driven by sort of elementary logic. That there is something deeper, and that there is an instinct that speaks to our conscience, and good deeds that could be made possible. I mean, one has to look at the example of how slavery was overcome. I mean, slavery was almost a perfect business model, and everyone profited from it except the slave, right? But labor costs were reduced to practically zero. And the profits reaped from it were huge, absolutely huge. And you can imagine when the first abolitionists began to speak out, and the first banks said, we're not going to do this anymore, how the rest of the business community would have been furious, because these people were threatening these enormous profits that were being, scored on the back of the suffering of slaves. And yet it was inexorable that in time, good sense would overcome the yearning for profit.
What you're saying in part is that the experience, the understanding of human rights can touch anyone. That is partly what makes it special.
That's right.
And people can recognize this is the right thing to do and take action. And in a way, the 75th anniversary kind of embodies this contradiction that's been with this declaration. The fact that it's so obvious, the fact that it is often violated. It seems to me that this anniversary has this contradiction. We have to take pride in everything that it's accomplished and the enormous progress that's been made, but also realize that it's a challenge to make the next 75 years better.
Yeah. Yeah, in some, we're learning, but we're slow learners. I mean, humanity as such. And we revel in our individual achievements as communities, what we're able to discover and what we're able to create. But still lurking within us is something frightening. And unless we keep it in its cage and are wary of what we can unleash, then we will experience it time and again, and eventually we can't survive. We can't remain as sort of parasites devouring this globe until there's nothing left. And we have to sort of inject some sense into what it is that we're doing, common sense. And when speaking of the Universal Declaration, I always remember the words of P.C. Chang, the Chinese philosopher who was one of the five who was central to the drafting of the Declaration. And he said, what we tried to do with the Declaration is just help us become better human beings. We just, if we follow the Declaration, we become better human beings. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing.
That is not a bad thing at all. Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, thank you so much for joining me on Public Health on Call. Thank you for all of your work for human rights all across the globe.
Thank you so much. You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you. Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.